everything. And he, who had always controlled the rules, found himself on his knees, for a love he never planned to feel. But can a love born from a contract survive when the whole world tries to tear it apart? If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and tell us in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Your like helps this channel grow and keep bringing you more emotional stories like this. Share with someone special. The silence in the marble hall of the Blackwood estate wasn't just the absence of sound, it was a presence in itself. Olivia Bennet stood at the grand entrance in a simple ivory dress, nothing more than a whisper of satin. It was too elegant to be casual, yet too modest to be bridal. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a bouquet of white calla lilies, her mother's favorite. She could hear the echo of her own breath against the high vaulted ceilings, and in that moment the entire weight of the agreement she had signed pressed on her shoulders like invisible chains. Just hours earlier, she had become Olivia Blackwood, in name only. At 22, Olivia had grown up surrounded by vineyards, her world filled with the earthy perfume of grapes, the soft winds of Charleston, and dreams too fragile to survive the harsh reality of financial collapse. Her father's unexpected death had left behind not only sorrow, but a mountain of unpaid debts that threatened to swallow Bennet Vineyards, the soul of her family's legacy. Richard Blackwood had entered her life not as a man, but as a solution. He was 38, a billionaire CEO with a reputation for being untouchable, calculated, and emotionless. The press called him the Iceman of Wall Street. Shareholders praised his ability to make ruthless decisions without blinking. Women admired him from afar, always from afar. No one got close. And that was exactly how he wanted it. Their union had nothing to do with romance, and everything to do with image. Richard needed a wife, not for love, not for companionship, but to quell rumors, calm board members, and maintain the illusion of stability that Wall Street so desperately craved. Olivia needed to save her home, her mother, and the last piece of her father's memory that hadn't yet been auctioned off. The contract was clear: 5 years of marriage, no love, no passion, no physical intimacy, no emotional involvement, a perfectly curated arrangement of appearances, photo ops, and cold civilities. At the end of the term, a quiet divorce and generous compensation. No one was supposed to fall in love. Olivia had agreed, not out of ambition, but desperation, and perhaps a quiet hope that she could endure 5 years of emotional numbness in exchange for a life of peace later. She remembered the moment she signed the papers. Richard had barely looked at her, his suit perfectly pressed, his pen gliding over the signature line like he was approving a merger, not sealing someone's fate. When it was her turn, she had hesitated for just a second, and he had noticed. "You don't have to do this," he had said flatly, without lifting his eyes. "But if you do, understand what it means. I'm not the kind of man who changes the rules halfway through." Those words rang in her ears now as she walked through the long corridor toward the wing of the estate designated for her. The staff had been instructed to treat her with formality, not warmth. She would dine alone, attend events as required, and most nights sleep in a bedroom that looked more like a hotel suite than a place of rest. Richard's quarters were on the opposite side of the mansion. She had seen him briefly at the ceremony, a private affair attended only by lawyers, a judge and a photographer. He had looked immaculate in his tailored black suit, not a hair out of place, not a flicker of emotion as he slipped the ring onto her finger. There had been no kiss, no music, only the sound of signatures and the finality of vows spoken like legal clauses. Now standing inside her new room, cold, immaculate, decorated in pale neutrals with no trace of personality, Olivia felt the strangest mix of security and sorrow. The contract had bought her time, protection, and a future for her family, but it had cost her something she couldn't name, something sacred. She opened the window, letting in the evening air. The scent of night jasmine floated in, mingling with the faint hum of city lights far in the distance. She closed her eyes, trying to breathe through the ache that had settled in her chest like a quiet pain. This wasn't what she had imagined for herself. As a girl, she had dreamed of love letters, long walks under the stars, and the thrill of a first kiss that meant something. But tonight, she was a wife in name only, married to a man who had made it abundantly clear that he wanted her presence, but not her heart. And yet, there had been something, a flicker of something, when he helped her into the car after the ceremony. Their hands had brushed. His touch had been cool, precise, yet lingered half a second longer than it needed to. His eyes, usually cold steel, had hesitated, as if registering the softness of her skin. Was it possible that he had felt something? Or was that just her own foolishness reaching for warmth in a place that would never give it? The knock on the door startled her. It was soft, polite, almost hesitant. "Mrs. Blackwood," came a voice, not Richard's but the housekeeper. "Mr. Blackwood asked me to remind you that dinner will be served at 8 in the East Wing dining room. Formal attire." Olivia nodded silently, though no one could see her, and turned back toward the mirror. Mrs. Blackwood. The title didn't feel real. It felt like a costume, something she wore for show, not for meaning. She touched the silver pendant at her neck, her father's last gift, and whispered, "I did this for us, Papa. I hope it was the right choice." She dressed in silence, choosing a pale blue gown that complemented her eyes, but made her feel more like a porcelain doll than a woman. Her hair was swept into a low chignon, elegant and impersonal. She looked like someone from a magazine, beautiful but untouchable. When she entered the dining room, Richard was already seated at the head of the long table, scanning something on his tablet. He wore a dark grey suit, crisp and commanding. The room was dimly lit, with golden chandeliers casting warm shadows across the table set for two. He looked up when she approached and stood, a gesture so unexpected it made her pause. "Olivia," he said, his voice low, unreadable, "you look appropriate." Appropriate, not beautiful, not stunning, just appropriate. She nodded, taking her seat across from him. The distance between them felt like miles. The air was filled with clinking silverware and silence. They exchanged few words, polite questions about her flight, the vineyard, her plans. No mention of the ceremony, no comment on the ring that now encircled her finger like a delicate shackle. But near the end of the meal, something in Richard's demeanor shifted. He glanced at her, then away, as if torn between his own rules and something else stirring beneath them. "I trust the room is satisfactory?" he asked finally. "Yes, thank you," Olivia replied, her voice calm but soft. "If you need anything, you may speak to Mrs. Langley. She'll make sure you're comfortable." She nodded again, not expecting more. But as she rose to leave, he surprised her. "Olivia," he said, and for the first time, there was a trace of something human in his voice. "Tomorrow I'll have a car take you to the city. If there's anything you need, clothes, materials, things that make you feel at home, you can get them." She turned to face him, trying to read the unspoken message in his eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, unsure of what else to say. As she left the room, she couldn't help but wonder, was that kindness or control? Or was the Iceman beginning to melt? The corridor was dimly lit, lined with antique sconces that flickered gently as Olivia walked toward her room. The heels of her shoes clicked softly against the polished wooden floors, echoing down the hall like a whisper. She had changed after dinner, slipping out of the icy blue gown and into something more comfortable, not lingerie, but a delicate cotton robe embroidered with tiny vines along the hem, soft, simple, pure. She had no intention of inviting anything other than solitude tonight. It was her wedding night, but there would be no celebration, no soft music, no murmured declarations, just the weight of a contract between them, carved into silence. She stood by the window again, drawn to the open air. Outside, the garden was quiet under the moonlight, the manicured hedges casting gentle shadows across the stone pathways. The night carried the scent of roses and late summer rain. It should have been romantic, but the room behind her remained cold. She didn't know why her heart was racing. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the haunting question from earlier. Was Richard's gesture at dinner, offering her freedom to feel at home, a flicker of kindness, or something else entirely? Olivia shook her head and tried to let go of the thoughts that kept circling. She ran her fingers through her hair, letting it fall freely over her shoulders. It felt good to shed the formality, to simply be. Then came the knock. Not the housekeeper this time, a different knock, slower, lower, hesitant. She turned. The door opened an inch, and then two. Richard stepped inside without waiting for an answer, dressed in black slacks and a crisp white shirt, unbuttoned at the collar. No tie, no jacket. His sleeves were rolled up. The man who usually carried the sharp edge of command now looked almost human, almost lost. "I should have called first," he said quietly. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The air between them pulsed with something neither of them understood. Tension, curiosity, something unnamed. He stepped further in, closing the door behind him. His eyes moved across the room, then landed on her. "You're not what I expected," he said. Olivia's heart thudded. "Is that a good thing?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. His gaze dropped to her hands, clasped in front of her, uncertain, then lifted again. "I meant what I said at dinner. If there's anything you want, you can have it. I want you to feel safe here." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Safe, but not wanted." Richard's jaw tightened. "That's not what I—" She took a step forward. "You made the rules, Richard. No intimacy, no emotion. I signed the contract. I understand my place." "I know you do," he murmured, "but I'm beginning to wonder if I do." The silence that followed was thick, the kind that pressed against the skin. He moved slowly, closing the space between them without fully crossing it. "You shouldn't be alone on your wedding night," he said softly. She met his gaze steady despite the tremor rising in her chest. "We agreed." "I know. Then why are you here?" He swallowed. Something flickered in his expression. Not desire, not exactly. Hunger, yes, but deeper. A kind of ache. A kind of longing he hadn't planned on feeling. "I saw you tonight," he said, voice lower now. "Not just the girl who signed the contract. I saw a woman who carries herself with grace, dignity, a quiet strength." She didn't reply. "I never thought that would matter," he went on, his voice strained. "But it does." She felt her breath catch in her throat. Not because of the words, but because he meant them. "I'm not asking for anything," he said, finally stepping closer. "But if I leave now, I'll regret it. I'll lie awake wondering what would have happened if I'd stayed." Her voice was barely a whisper. "And if you stay?" He paused. "I might forget the contract." His hand reached for hers, and when their fingers touched, it wasn't forceful. It was reverent. The way someone touches something sacred. Olivia felt the heat of his skin, and her breath trembled. This wasn't about lust. Not really. It was about the unbearable closeness of being seen. When he leaned in, it wasn't sudden. His eyes asked a silent question, and she gave a silent answer by not moving away. Their lips met like a sigh, soft, searching, unsure, but real. The kiss deepened. Not hungry, but desperate in its tenderness. His hands cradled her face, as if he needed to memorize every detail. She let her fingers trail along his jaw, the stubble rough against her palm. There was no rush, no force, just the quiet unfolding of something neither of them expected. He pulled back for a moment, his forehead resting against hers. His breath was uneven. "Tell me to go," he whispered. She closed her eyes. "I don't want you to." He let out a quiet sound, part relief, part confession, and kissed her again, slower this time. He led her gently to the bed. Every touch deliberate, every gesture asking, not taking. And when they lay down together, it wasn't about breaking rules. It was about breaking masks. The clothes came off slowly, discarded with care, not haste. His hands were warm, his mouth reverent. She didn't feel like a contract. She felt like a woman. A woman who had just stepped into a moment she hadn't even dared to dream of. He wasn't the cold CEO, not tonight, and she wasn't the desperate girl trying to save her father's vineyard. They were just two souls who had been alone too long. Afterward, the silence returned. But it was a different silence, softer, full, like the room itself was holding its breath. He didn't speak, neither did she. She turned slightly in bed, expecting him to roll away, to put up the wall again. But he didn't. He stayed close. One hand on her hip, his face half hidden in the curve of her shoulder. It felt real. Too real. She wanted to ask what this meant. She wanted to believe it had changed something. But as she lay there, heart still racing from a kiss that was never supposed to happen, one thought gnawed at her. What will tomorrow bring? When the contract comes back between them. The morning light crept in gently through the sheer curtains, brushing soft gold across the white linen sheets. Olivia stirred, her skin still warm where his touch had lingered hours before. Her eyes fluttered open slowly, and for a brief, breathless second, she believed it had all been a dream. The kiss, the way he held her, the silence thick with meaning. But when she reached beside her, the bed was cold. Empty. Her fingers grasped only linen and absence. She sat up, the sheets gathering around her waist, and looked around the room. No sign of him, no sound of footsteps, no lingering cologne. Just the quiet hum of the estate waking up to a new day, like nothing had happened, as if the night they shared never existed. She pressed her hand to her lips, still remembering the way he had kissed her, not like a man fulfilling a duty, but like someone tasting vulnerability for the first time. Every touch, every whisper had felt honest, tender, human, so why had he disappeared before sunrise? She rose slowly, wrapping the robe around her as she walked barefoot to the window. Outside, the world was already in motion, gardeners tending the lawns, staff moving with silent efficiency. Life continued, indifferent to the ache blooming in her chest. A soft knock came on the door. It wasn't Richard. It was Mrs. Langley, holding a silver tray with tea and fresh strawberries. "Good morning, Mrs. Blackwood," she said with her usual polite smile. "Mr. Blackwood asked me to inform you that he's already left for the office. He won't be returning until late tonight." Olivia nodded slowly, her voice caught somewhere in her throat. "Did he say anything else?" The housekeeper hesitated. "Only that your schedule remains unchanged. You're welcome to use the car if you'd like to go into the city." That was it. No note, no message, no explanation. The door closed again, and with it, the silence grew louder. Olivia walked back to the bed and sat down slowly, clutching the robe tighter around her. Something inside her, something soft and hopeful, cracked. She had known the contract by heart. She had accepted the terms. She never expected love. She never asked for it. But he had come to her. He had stayed. He had touched her like she mattered. And now, he was gone. The hours crawled by. She dressed, ate little, wandered the halls. But everywhere she went, she felt like a ghost in her own life. A woman who had briefly tasted connection, only to have it ripped away without warning. By the time evening came, the sky painted in streaks of rose and grey, Olivia felt something colder begin to settle in her chest. Not anger. Not yet. Just confusion. A quiet hurt that dug deeper than she wanted to admit. She decided to wait in the study. Maybe he would come home. Maybe he would look at her the way he had the night before. Maybe he would explain. The grandfather clock struck 10. No sign of him. At 10:30, she heard the distant sound of tires on gravel. A car door. Footsteps. And then nothing. She stood, walked to the hallway and found him there, loosening his tie, eyes dark with exhaustion. "Richard," she said softly. He looked up. For a fraction of a second, something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe. Or regret. But it vanished quickly. "I didn't expect you to wait up," he said. "I needed to talk to you." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Olivia, whatever you think happened last night." She froze. Think happened. He avoided her eyes. It was a mistake. The words hit her like a slap, sharp, sudden, cold. She blinked. "A mistake? I broke the agreement. I shouldn't have come to your room. I let my guard down, and it won't happen again." She stepped closer, her voice shaking. "You came to me, you kissed me, you asked to stay. Don't turn this into something I imagined." "I'm not," he said, his tone flat. "But it was still a lapse in judgment. That's all." "A lapse?" she whispered, disbelief tightening her chest. "You looked at me like I was more than a contract." His eyes flicked to hers, then away. "I wasn't thinking clearly." Her stomach twisted. "So you just used me?" His expression darkened. "Don't twist this, Olivia." "Then explain it to me," she demanded, the calm slipping from her voice. Help me understand how you go from holding me like I was the only person in the world to pretending it never happened. Silence. He said nothing. And that silence was worse than any excuse he could have given. She took a slow breath, willing herself not to cry. Not here, not now. I didn't ask for any of this, she said, voice low. You made the rules. I followed them. You broke them. And now, I'm the one paying for it. His face was unreadable. His silence, impenetrable. Finally, he said, I think it's best if we keep our distance. Emotions complicate things. We have an agreement, and I intend to honor it. She stared at him, heart thudding in disbelief. Then don't ever come near me like that again, she said, her voice trembling but strong. I won't, he replied. She walked past him, the sound of her bare feet echoing down the hallway, and for the first time since entering this house she didn't feel fragile. She felt something sharper, a flicker of fire beneath the ache. Back in her room, she closed the door behind her and leaned against it, eyes burning. She had made a choice to give herself to him, not out of obligation but trust, and he had taken it, then thrown it into the shadows like it meant nothing. But Olivia Bennet was not made of shadows. She wiped her tears, walked to the mirror, and saw a woman staring back who was done waiting for someone else to validate her worth. Whatever happened next, she would not let this house or this man define her. The days that followed were hollow. Richard didn't speak to her beyond the necessary civilities. He came and went like a shadow, always distant, always guarded, as if that night had burned him in ways he wasn't willing to confront. Olivia stopped trying to understand his silence. She stopped waiting by the hallway, stopped listening for the sound of his footsteps. She retreated into herself, not out of weakness, but out of instinct, like a flower closing its petals against the storm. The Blackwood estate, with its ornate halls and endless rooms, became a palace of echoes, a place too vast for one soul to feel seen. Olivia would wake early and walk the corridors in soft slippers, each step a small rebellion against despair. She explored parts of the house no one used anymore, forgotten parlors, a dusty music room, old storage wings filled with antiques wrapped in white sheets. She became familiar with the silence, learned to breathe through it even when it felt like it was pressing against her lungs. One morning, just after a rainstorm had passed, she stumbled upon a wing tucked behind the east side of the estate, a part she hadn't explored. The heavy door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing a long hallway leading to a tall arch of stained glass. At the end of the corridor was a glass ceiling draped in ivy, the Blackwood Conservatory, long abandoned. And in the center, overrun with vines and silence, was a garden of stone, glass, and wild air. The space was bathed in golden morning light. Dust particles floated in the air like tiny spirits. Old flower beds, once elegant, had been left to grow wild. A wrought-iron bench, half swallowed by jasmine, waited patiently beneath a cracked statue of Eros. Something about the forgotten beauty of the place made Olivia's chest ache. It didn't demand anything from her. It simply existed, like her, untouched, overlooked, waiting to be remembered. That's when she knew. This would be her sanctuary. She spent the rest of the day cleaning it. She opened the windows wide, letting the breeze sweep through. She pulled ivy off the walls, trimmed back the overgrowth, scrubbed the glass until it caught the light again. Her hands blistered, her nails cracked, but she didn't stop. There was something healing in the work, a rhythm that asked nothing of her, but presence. In a storage room beside the conservatory, she discovered a long-forgotten table, rusted tools, dusty sketchpads, and drawers filled with old beads, chains, and metal pieces. Her breath caught in her throat. She knew these tools. She had used ones just like them as a teenager in Charleston, sitting in the back of Mr. Delaney's tiny shop in the old district, where she had spent hours watching him bend wire and set stones into silver. He had been a friend of her father's, and when vineyard life overwhelmed her, she had escaped there, learning not just technique, but patience, precision, soul. Olivia picked up a pair of pliers, rusty but still functional. Her fingers remembered. The way memory lives in the body before the mind catches up. She sat at the bench and began. At first it was just play, rearranging beads, twisting wires into shapes. letting her fingers move without expectation. But soon the hours disappeared into creation. Her first piece was a simple pendant, a tiny silver heart wrapped in copper vines. Not perfect, but honest. Then came earrings, small and intricate, inspired by the jasmine blooming outside. She began sketching designs every morning. At night she refined them. Her fingers worked until they ached, but the ache felt good, like proof of something being born again. It wasn't about selling, it wasn't about being seen, it was about breathing again, feeling again. She crafted a pair of teardrop earrings with mother-of-pearl she found in an old box, shaping them like droplets of memory. A necklace that curved like the branches outside. A bracelet that mirrored the stained glass colors above the garden. Each piece was quiet, feminine, full of her. And yet the world outside the conservatory remained unchanged. She still dined alone. Richard remained a ghost behind closed doors. But something within Olivia began to shift. She started wearing her creations, not as fashion but as armor, as reminders. One morning she came down to breakfast wearing a delicate gold ring she had made from melted scraps. The staff noticed. A few days later she wore a handcrafted brooch to a charity event she was required to attend. One of the guests, an older woman with impeccable taste, complimented it. "Who designed that?" she asked, eyes narrowing with interest. "I did," Olivia answered quietly. The woman blinked, surprised, then smiled. "You have an eye, that piece speaks." That was the first time Olivia realized her art wasn't invisible. She wasn't invisible. Back in her sanctuary, she began working with more intention. She researched stone meanings, let herself create collections inspired by emotion, grief, hope, longing. She named them privately, tucked them into velvet boxes, never imagining anyone would care. And yet, the house began to shift in quiet ways. One afternoon, Richard came home early and paused at the hallway that overlooked the garden. He saw her there beneath the ivy-draped arch, focused, hands moving with delicate precision. She didn't notice him. He didn't speak. He only watched. She was radiant in a way he hadn't expected, not polished, not poised, but alive. Something about the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the way her hands moved like music, the way she smiled, just slightly, when something worked. It unsettled him, because she didn't need him, and he hadn't planned on that. That night, Olivia returned to her room, unaware of the eyes that had watched her. She lit a small candle by the windowsill and sat with her latest piece, a necklace shaped like two broken pieces meeting at a single point. She hadn't planned it that way. It had just happened. She stared at it for a long while, then whispered, "Maybe broken things can still belong." She didn't know it yet, but this rediscovery, this quiet defiance was the beginning of her becoming. Not his wife, not his contract, herself. The morning sun filtered through the stained glass ceiling, casting pools of amber and sapphire across the conservatory floor. Olivia sat at her workbench, fingers stained with gold dust, her hair loosely tied back with a ribbon that had once belonged to her mother. A soft breeze stirred the jasmine vines that framed the windows, and the scent mixed with the subtle perfume of melted wax and polished silver. She had finished her latest collection the night before, 6 unique pieces, each inspired by a season of the soul. Bloom was a pendant, shaped like a budding rose, its petals crafted from pink tourmaline. Storm was a pair of sharp-angled earrings, dark with onyx and iron. Stillness, a bracelet of moonstone and fine thread, felt like quiet nights and wordless grief. She had named the series Light of Soul, though no one but her knew that yet. Olivia didn't seek validation, not anymore. Her art had become something personal, a place to place the things she couldn't say aloud, the nights she cried in silence, the ache of being both wife and stranger in her own home, the strength she had found in the solitude. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. It started with an unplanned encounter. One afternoon, Olivia was asked to attend a garden luncheon hosted at the Blackwood estate. A formality, a gathering of directors' wives and socialites, the kind of event Richard usually avoided, but insisted Olivia be present for. She wore a cream silk dress, elegant but understated. Around her neck she fastened bloom, the pendant she had crafted in the early days of rediscovery. She wasn't trying to make a statement. She just didn't want to feel invisible. The reaction was immediate. Within minutes of her arrival, a woman in a navy blue suit approached her with a sharp gaze and a curious smile. It was Evelyn Hart, wife of Gregory Hart, one of Blackwood Global's oldest partners. "My dear," Evelyn said, lifting her champagne glass slightly, "where did you get that necklace?" Olivia blinked. "I made it." "You made it?" Her eyes widened. "As in designed and crafted?" "Yes," Olivia replied, suddenly unsure if that was the right answer. Evelyn's smile softened. "It's exquisite. It has emotion, not just design. Where did you learn?" Olivia hesitated. "A small shop in Charleston. When I was younger, I just picked it back up recently." "Don't stop," Evelyn said, her voice low and sure. "Whatever you're doing, it's speaking." The conversation spread like quiet wildfire. By the end of the event, 3 different women had asked about her necklace. One asked if she could commission something similar, but in emerald. Another wanted earrings for her daughter's wedding. A third simply said, "There's a story in your work. I want to hear it." Olivia returned to the conservatory with a strange blend of disbelief and warmth humming in her chest. She didn't tell anyone. Not yet. But the next morning, a handwritten note arrived, elegant, scented with lavender. "Dear Mrs. Blackwood, if ever you consider offering your work to the world, please allow me to be your first client. With admiration, Evelyn Hart." Olivia stood holding the note, her fingers trembling slightly. Something inside her shifted, not because someone wanted to buy her art, but because someone saw her. That night she wore her own handcrafted earrings to dinner. Richard, as always, sat at the far end of the long table, reading something on his tablet. But for a moment, just a flicker, his eyes lifted. They stopped on her earrings, then on her hands, then briefly on her face. She caught it. He looked away too quickly, but she had seen it, the question behind his eyes. She didn't speak. The next morning, she left a small velvet box on the table in the hallway near his office. Inside was a silver cufflink set, subtle, elegant, forged from the same design language as Storm, the piece born from her frustration and strength. No note, no explanation. She didn't need to say anything. She wasn't asking for recognition. She was leaving a mark. Later that week, Olivia was invited to a private showing at a boutique in Manhattan, a favor from Evelyn. She declined, but she agreed to let Evelyn take a few pieces, just to see, just to feel what it was like to be out in the world again. The boutique owner called 2 days later, breathless. "We sold 3 pieces in less than an hour. Who is this artist? We want more." Olivia smiled softly, still seated in her garden sanctuary. She looked down at her sketch pad, her pencil resting on the outline of a design titled Reclaim. She whispered, "Her name is Olivia." And for the first time, the name didn't sound borrowed. It sounded like it belonged to someone who had become more than what she was given, more than wife, more than contract, more than what Richard had once allowed himself to see. Unbeknownst to her, Richard had heard about the boutique. Evelyn had mentioned it in passing during a board meeting, praising Olivia's emerging artistic brilliance. He hadn't said a word in response. But when he returned home that night, he walked to the conservatory door and stopped. He stood there, watching again. She was barefoot this time, hair loose, humming softly to herself as she adjusted a clasp on a bracelet. There was light in her, not from the sun, but from within, a quiet kind of power. He didn't know why it made his throat tighten, or why he couldn't look away. Back in his study, he opened the velvet box she had left days ago. He placed the cufflinks in his palm, ran his thumb along the edge, and for the first time in years, let himself feel something that had no definition. Pride, regret, longing. He didn't know yet, but he knew this much. The woman he had married to keep things simple was becoming the one person who complicated everything. The invitation arrived on cream gold cardstock, stamped with a royal seal, and a handwritten signature in ink as dark as wine. "You are cordially invited to the annual masquerade ball of Her Grace, the Duchess of Wessex, in celebration of tradition, art, and influence. Olivia read it twice before setting it down on the table. The Duchess of Wessex's masquerade was the most exclusive event of the New York elite, a gathering where fortunes were flaunted behind silk masks, and every step across the marble floors meant 1,000 silent judgments. To be invited was a privilege, to attend a declaration. Richard knocked once before entering her sitting room, unusually quiet. He didn't meet her eyes at first, only gestured toward the envelope. "We're expected to attend." Olivia raised an eyebrow. "We? They want a show of stability. The Duchess is old money and the board has a soft spot for tradition. She has eyes everywhere." Olivia studied him for a moment. His face was unreadable, the perfect executive, controlled, cold, but something in his voice had a falter. "And you need your wife to be as ornamental," she said, "not bitter, just factual." "I need my wife to stand by my side," he replied, finally meeting her gaze. "But you're not ornamental, Olivia, not anymore." That admission, small and sharp, lodged itself somewhere beneath her ribs. He turned to leave but paused at the door. "A dress has been ordered, a French designer. It should arrive by Friday." She waited until he was gone before walking back to the conservatory, her safe place. Her heartbeat still echoed in her ears. A dress had been ordered, but it wouldn't be the dress she wore. That night, she opened the chest where she kept her most personal creations, the ones she never intended to sell. Pieces made with emotion so raw, they felt like pages torn from her own diary. From those she began sketching a vision, not for the world, but for herself. She would not enter that ballroom as a shadow of Richard Blackwood's reputation. She would enter as Olivia. She worked for 3 days straight, sketching, crafting, fitting. The dress she eventually chose was understated, deep emerald green with a clean silhouette, but it was the jewelry that told the story. A golden pearl collar necklace shaped like ivy vines, curling protectively around her throat. Earrings of labradorite, stones known for intuition and transformation. A cuff bracelet engraved with invisible markings in the language of vines and grief. Her mask, made by her own hands. Gold filigree with hints of forest green and soft crystals. Feminine, mysterious, fierce. When the car arrived, Olivia stepped into it without fanfare. Richard waited inside, impeccably dressed in a tailored black suit with a silver half-mask. He didn't speak for a long moment. He simply stared. "You didn't wear the dress," he said at last. "I wore myself," she answered. He didn't respond, but he couldn't look away. The ballroom at the Grand Astoria Hotel was a cathedral of excess. Marble columns, golden chandeliers, walls draped in velvet. Guests moved like dancers in a silent opera, faces hidden behind feathers, silk, and mystery. Olivia walked beside Richard as cameras flashed. Every movement she made was deliberate, graceful without apology. Heads turned, conversations paused. Even behind masks, she felt their eyes. "Who is she?" someone whispered as they passed. Richard placed a hand lightly at her back, not possessive, not performative, as if grounding himself, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing either. Inside the ballroom, the Duchess herself made an entrance, her mask glittering like starlight. But even her grace paused when she noticed Olivia's necklace. "Exquisite," she murmured. "Who designed your jewelry, my dear?" Olivia didn't hesitate. "I did." The Duchess blinked behind her veil. "Truly." "I design and create each piece by hand," Olivia said, her voice calm but firm. "This collection is called Resilience. It's not for sale." A silence fell. Not discomfort, reverence. Then came the applause, subtle at first, then spreading, a few claps, then more, until it became a soft wave of acknowledgement, like rain falling on marble. Richard stood frozen beside her, watching it unfold. His world, meticulously controlled, calculated, was being cracked open by the woman he had once called a contract. And he didn't know what stunned him more, the applause or the fact that she no longer looked like she needed his approval to shine. Later they danced. It wasn't planned, it wasn't spoken. A waltz began, one of those old European ones where touch is a language. He extended his hand. She took it, his hand on her waist, her palm resting against his chest. She could feel his heartbeat, slow, measured, then not. They moved together, barely speaking. "You've changed," he said softly, eyes searching her through the mask. "No," she whispered. "You just never saw me." He didn't reply. But the silence between them spoke everything. When the dance ended, applause returned. Not for them, for the orchestra. But Olivia noticed something new, the way people looked at her. Not as a wife, not as a name beside a billionaire, as a woman who carried power in silence, as an artist, as herself. And Richard, he watched her with a quiet mix of awe and something darker, jealousy perhaps, not of her success but of the world now seeing what he had ignored. On the ride home, silence filled the car again. But it wasn't cold, it was charged, heavy, real. She stared out the window. He stared at her reflection, and for the first time he asked himself a question he never thought he'd ask. Had he already lost her, before he ever truly had her? The morning after the masquerade, the city's elite was still buzzing. Gossip columns overflowed with speculation. Who was the woman in emerald? Whose mask held the secrets of power and elegance? Photos leaked across social media showed glimpses of Olivia's gold filigree mask, her glowing presence beside the ever-unreadable Richard Blackwood, and, most of all, the jewelry. It wasn't just admired. It was talked about, analyzed, desired. But Olivia didn't wake up seeking praise. She rose quietly, as she always did, letting sunlight filter into the conservatory where her hands had first remembered how to create. Her fingers were sore from weeks of work, but her heart was oddly light. Not because people clapped, not because the Duchess asked for her card, but because she had spoken without saying much at all, and the world had listened. It was Evelyn Hart who orchestrated what came next. 2 days later, the Blackwoods were invited to a private reception at the Wessex Gallery, a gathering of artists, collectors and patrons under the guise of celebrating emerging creative voices. Olivia knew it was no coincidence. Evelyn had whispered to the right ears. Richard brought it up over breakfast, barely glancing up from his phone. "You've been requested to attend. It's expected." Olivia stirred her tea calmly. "They want me, not us." He looked up then, his jaw tightening just enough to betray discomfort. "You're still my wife." "I'm aware," she said softly. "But this isn't your stage, Richard. It's mine." He said nothing more, but he went with her. The event was smaller than the masquerade, but no less elegant. High ceilings, white walls washed in soft golden light, and glass cases displaying sculptures, paintings, and jewelry under spotlights. Olivia's pieces had been arranged on velvet trays in the center gallery, each item labeled discreetly, Artist Olivia Bennett Blackwood, Collection Light of Soul. Guests wandered through with crystal flutes in hand, admiring not just the craftsmanship, but the feeling each piece evoked. There was reverence in the room, an unspoken understanding that these weren't mere accessories. They were confessions cast in metal and stone. Olivia stood a few steps back, watching in silence. She wore a black silk dress and simple clean, and her hair swept behind her ears to show the delicate spiral earrings she had finished the night before. The same woman who had once felt small in Blackwood Estate now stood tall under lights that warmed her skin and soul. It was Evelyn who pulled her forward. "You need to speak," she whispered. "They're asking who made these." "I already told them." "You need to say it out loud." A curator stepped forward, gesturing toward the center of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I've had the honor of showcasing many designers, but tonight we welcome a woman whose work speaks not only of aesthetic beauty, but of emotional truth. Please, Mrs. Blackwood, if you would." All eyes turned. Olivia hesitated only a second. Then she stepped forward, calm, collected, radiant in a way that didn't scream, but whispered truth. She cleared her throat, her voice soft but unwavering. "I created these pieces," she said, "each one with my own hands. Not in a studio in Paris, not in a lab, but in a forgotten corner of my home where I remembered who I was." Silence. Then, slowly, applause. Not loud, not forced. Respectful, real. Richard stood at the back of the room, half in shadow, watching her. He had heard her speak to shareholders before, polite, scripted, cautious. But this was a woman fully in her skin, no script, no pretense. just power. He couldn't deny the pride that bloomed in his chest, nor the heat that followed it. Pride turned to something tighter, jealousy, not of her success, but of the fact that this version of Olivia, this force of quiet brilliance, had grown without him, without his guidance, without his permission. She no longer looked at him like she was trying to understand him. She no longer looked at him like she needed him. After the applause faded, a group of women gathered around Olivia, curators, designers, gallery owners, asking questions, making offers, suggesting collaborations. Some of them had known her for months as Richard Blackwood's wife, but now they saw her. One leaned in and asked with a wry smile, "What made you start creating again?" Olivia smiled, eyes gleaming with something deeper than defiance. "I needed to remember who I was before I became someone else's idea of me." That sentence rippled through the group like a bell toll. Richard heard it too. It echoed in his ribs like a truth he didn't want to face. On the way home, the silence in the car was different, heavy, but not cold. She looked out the window. He looked at her hands, the same hands that had once touched him with hesitation, now moved through the world with conviction. "You were remarkable tonight," he said finally. "Thank you," she answered. He paused. "I didn't realize," she turned toward him. "Didn't realize what?" "That you had this in you." She raised an eyebrow. "Or that I didn't need you to find it." He winced, just slightly, but enough. The rest of the ride passed in silence. When they returned to the estate, she walked ahead, not waiting for him. In the dim hallway, she stopped for a moment, turning back. "You told me once you didn't change the rules," she said, "but I think you just never knew how much the rules never applied to me." Then she disappeared down the corridor. Richard stood alone, his heart echoing with the sound of her footsteps, unsure if the admiration he now felt had arrived too late. The house was quiet when Olivia returned from the gallery. Not the cold, echoing kind of silence that had once haunted the Blackwood estate, but a charged, waiting silence, like the air before a storm or the hush between two heartbeats. She walked through the marble hallway with measured steps, heels clicking softly, her fingers grazing the hand-carved wood of the banister as if anchoring herself in something real. Her dress still held the warmth of the lights that had illuminated her on the gallery floor. Her pulse still echoed with the applause, but it wasn't pride that pulsed in her chest now. It was clarity. She had spoken as herself, and the world had listened, and Richard had watched. Olivia stepped into her sitting room, pulled the pins from her hair and let it fall around her shoulders. She didn't rush to change out of the black silk gown. She wanted to feel every moment of this new version of herself, the version that no longer waited, no longer asked. She poured a glass of water, walked to the window, and looked out into the garden. Moonlight glinted against the ivy and the glass dome above the conservatory where her hands had found life again. For the first time since their wedding night, she felt something stir deep in her chest. Not longing, but calm. Not loneliness, but anticipation. A knock came at the door. She didn't need to ask who it was. "Come in," she said softly. The door opened slowly, and Richard stepped inside, still in his tailored suit, tie slightly loosened. His mask from the gallery, the one he wore so often in boardrooms and social functions, was gone now. He looked tired. Not physically, emotionally. Stripped. "Hi," he said. "Hi," she answered, her tone unreadable. He stepped inside and closed the door gently behind him, as if afraid the sound would shatter the fragile air between them. "I couldn't sleep," he said, voice low. She didn't move. "That makes two of us." He nodded slowly, then added, "I saw you tonight." She raised an eyebrow. "You've seen me every day for months." "Not like that," he said. "Not with eyes open." She tilted her head slightly, curious, waiting. Richard took a breath and crossed the room, stopping a few feet away from her. "You were brilliant, Olivia, not just beautiful, not just poised. You were powerful. I've spent my life surrounded by people who want something from me, and tonight I realized I've spent months married to someone who never asked for anything, and somehow gave me everything I didn't know I needed." Her throat tightened. He continued, his voice softer now. "I built this entire life around control, around logic. So I thought if I kept everything in order, nothing could hurt me. I thought love was a distraction, that vulnerability was weakness. But then you happened. She said nothing. He took one step closer, and suddenly silence started to feel like punishment. And your absence, and even when you were in the same room, felt louder than any noise. Her eyes shimmered. I've tried to push you away, he admitted. I've tried to convince myself that what happened that night, the first night, was just a mistake. That I could go back to being the man who didn't feel anything. And did it work? She asked, barely above a whisper. He shook his head slowly. No. It broke me. The words landed between them like confession. He stepped closer now, only inches away, his voice trembling. I don't know what this is supposed to look like. I don't have the answers. But I know I don't want to keep pretending that you're just part of a contract. I see you, Olivia. I see your fire, your strength, your heart. And if you let me, I want to be where you are. Her breath caught. Tonight, he said, voice cracking. I don't want to sleep alone, not because I need comfort, but because I want to choose you, fully, without rules, without fear. He held out his hand. No pressure. Just an invitation. She looked at it for a long moment, the same hand that had once held a pen and drawn her into a life of cold agreements. But tonight, it offered something else. Trust. She took it. Their fingers laced together, and the room exhaled with them. He led her gently to the bedroom. No urgency, no rush. He helped her out of the gown like he was unwrapping something sacred, his hands reverent, his touch unhurried. She undid the buttons of his shirt, fingers brushing over the scar near his shoulder, one she had never asked about before. He let her touch it, let her see him, truly see him, for the first time. They moved together slowly, not like strangers, not like lovers from a contract, but like two people shedding the final layer of armor. When he kissed her, it wasn't hesitant like before, and it wasn't desperate either. It was quiet and deep, a kind of homecoming. His lips traced the path from her temple to her collarbone like he was memorizing a prayer. He whispered her name once, like a vow, and she answered with a touch that said, I'm here. They didn't speak much after, just breathed each other in. Shared silence, shared space. Afterward, they lay tangled beneath the sheets, her head resting on his chest, his hand tracing soft circles on her back. The moonlight cast soft shadows across the room. He broke the silence first. Do you regret any of it? She looked up, searching his eyes. No, she said, not even the worst parts, because they brought us here. He kissed her forehead, and for the first time since they met, she felt him exhale, fully, as if 1,000 invisible chains had finally fallen away. Outside, wind stirred the ivy on the windows. Inside, for the first time, two people, once bound by duty, had found something that couldn't be written into any agreement. A beginning. But even in that stillness, one question remained, not spoken, but lingering between their bodies. Would love be enough when the rest of the world came knocking? The days that followed their second night together unfolded like petals in spring, quiet, deliberate, unexpected. No grand declarations, no fireworks, just the simple, quiet unraveling of two souls who had finally dropped their guard. Olivia woke the next morning in Richard's arms, not in a palace of doubt, but in the stillness of something real. He didn't rush to leave the bed. He didn't retreat into silence. He stayed. When she opened her eyes, he was already watching her, his hand brushing a strand of hair from her cheek like it was the most natural thing in the world. Good morning, he whispered. She smiled. It is. They had breakfast together for the first time without pretense. Not across a long dining table like strangers, but in the small sunroom off the east corridor. He made coffee, she made toast. There were awkward moments. Richard had no idea how to work the antique toaster, but they laughed, really laughed. It felt domestic, real. And Richard, the man who once orchestrated every moment of his life like a chessboard, began to let go. He cancelled 2 meetings that day, took her for a walk through the vineyard trails on the edge of the estate, a part of the property he hadn't visited in years. As they walked among the vines, he asked questions about her designs, Not polite curiosities, real ones. "What inspires the shape of your pendants?" he asked, genuinely. She smiled. "Emotion. Sometimes grief, sometimes joy, sometimes silence." He looked at her with something between awe and guilt. "I wish I had known that sooner." "You didn't want to know," she said, not with bitterness, but truth. And he nodded, accepting it. That night she invited him into her world. She brought him into the conservatory, her sacred place, showed him the sketchbook she had hidden for months, the trial pieces that had never been worn, the necklace she had made the night after he left her cold, a fragile silver branch twisted into a loop, titled Unfinished Apology. He held it in his hand, speechless. "I didn't realize I was part of your work," he said. "You were always part of it," she answered, "even when you weren't there." He looked at her, a quiet sorrow in his eyes, then set the necklace down and kissed the inside of her wrist, slowly, deliberately, as if apologizing without words. From that day on, something fundamental shifted. Richard began working from home more often. He moved his meetings to late afternoons so he could have breakfast with her in the mornings. He sat beside her in the conservatory sometimes, not talking, just existing in her space. He even started sketching once, badly. She laughed when he showed her his crooked, clumsy drawing of a bracelet, but he smiled anyway. "Designing a piece for my terrifying wife," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "Terrifying?" He grinned. "You terrify me, in all the right ways." He wasn't perfect. He was still learning how to be vulnerable. Sometimes she'd catch him retreating into silence, especially when the world outside demanded his armor again. But the difference now was, he always came back, and she always waited. Together, they created new rituals. Midnight walks through the garden, reading on the same couch, feet tangled under a shared blanket, late-night wine and old records, inside jokes, her humming while she worked, him stealing kisses between phone calls. One afternoon, she caught him staring at a painting above the fireplace in the main hallway, a dark, moody piece filled with storm clouds and a single silver bird in flight. "I always hated this painting," he murmured. "Then take it down," she replied. He looked at her, almost surprised. "I thought it had to stay. It's part of the Blackwood legacy." She smiled gently. "Legacies can be rewritten." He stared at the painting for another long moment, then took it off the wall. In its place they hung one of her sketches, a raw pencil rendering of two trees growing toward each other, their roots entwined beneath the earth. She titled it Becoming. It was a quiet rebellion, a small revolution. But to Richard, it was everything. Later that week, during a board dinner, Olivia arrived on his arm not as a silent accessory, but as a woman the room respected. Evelyn introduced her as the artist behind Light of Soul, and every conversation that followed was about her work, her vision, her growing brand. Richard didn't interrupt. He didn't correct. He didn't overshadow. He just watched her, with pride. When the dinner ended, he took her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles in front of everyone. It was subtle, but the meaning was loud. That night, back at the estate, they curled up on the couch, barefoot, sipping tea instead of champagne. She rested her head on his chest, listening to the beat of a heart that once felt unreachable. He ran his fingers through her hair and whispered, "Do you think it's possible to fall in love with the same person more than once?" She lifted her head and met his gaze. "I think we're still falling." He smiled, not the polished one he wore in boardrooms, but the one she had learned to treasure, the one that only appeared when he wasn't looking. "I used to think love made you weak," he said. "Now I think maybe it's the only thing that makes us strong." They sat there, wrapped in quiet warmth. No contracts, no rules, just two people discovering what it meant to be chosen, not out of obligation, but from the deepest part of themselves. And as the fire crackled beside them, Olivia whispered, "I'm glad you broke the rules." He kissed her temple, holding her close. And for once Richard Blackwood, the man who built an empire on logic and control, felt entirely unapologetically human. But neither of them knew that outside the walls of their sanctuary, new shadows were forming. Old ghosts, family secrets, and a name Olivia hadn't heard in years was about to return. The first real challenge didn't come from the outside world, it came from within the family. The invitation was addressed with the kind of calligraphy that could only belong to one person. Margaret Blackwood, Richard's aunt, the matriarch of the family, and the self-appointed guardian of heritage and propriety. A widow with no children but many opinions, she lived in a marble townhouse in the Upper East Side, surrounded by oil portraits, bone china, and a sense of superiority that was impossible to ignore. Dinner, Saturday, 8 sharp, formal. No signature, just a command. Olivia had only met Margaret once, briefly at the wedding ceremony. The woman had nodded in silence, eyes scanning her like an art piece she wasn't quite sure was authentic. Since then, not a word. Richard held the invitation in his hand, brow furrowed. "You don't have to go," he said. Olivia took it from him and read it again. "Yes, I do." He looked at her. "She's not easy. I'm not fragile." A pause. Then he nodded. They arrived at the townhouse that Saturday, greeted at the door by a butler in starched black. Olivia wore navy blue this time, classic, high neckline, long sleeves, elegant without being flashy. Around her neck, she wore her newest creation, a necklace of interwoven gold and garnet stones, subtle but strong, a design she called rooted. The message wasn't for fashion, it was armor. Inside, the house smelled like polished wood and aged money. The dining room was lit by a chandelier older than most countries. Margaret stood at the head of the table, a glass of port in her hand, her silver hair pulled into a perfect chignon. "Richard," she said coolly, "you're late." "We're on time," he replied, stepping forward. She turned to Olivia. "My dear," she said, voice lined with velvet and knives. "How artistic you look." Olivia smiled politely. "Thank you, that's the goal." Dinner began with stiff conversation. The table was long, covered in crystal and bone-white china. A few other guests had been invited, extended family members, cousins, one retired ambassador, all of them dressed in grey tones, sipping wine as if it were sacrament. And all of them watched Olivia. Some asked questions, polite, calculated ones. "So, jewelry, is that a hobby or a diversion? I heard you used to live on a vineyard. Was it terribly rustic? Is it difficult adjusting to this level of society?" Each word was dipped in civility, but Olivia heard the subtext. "You don't belong here. You're not one of us. You're an outsider with pretty stones," she responded with grace, humor, intelligence. But Margaret never smiled. She simply watched, sipping her wine with slow precision. And then it came. Over dessert, poached pears and silence, Margaret set down her fork and looked directly at Olivia. "I imagine it's been a transformation, becoming Mrs. Richard Blackwood." Olivia nodded slowly. "In many ways, yes. But I haven't become someone else, just more of myself." Margaret tilted her head. "That may be the most dangerous thing a woman can say in a room like this." Silence followed, sharp, tense. Then came a low voice, firm, unwavering. "She's not dangerous," Richard said. "She's exceptional." All eyes turned to him. Margaret arched a brow. "Oh." He set down his glass and leaned forward slightly. "Olivia didn't marry into this family for privilege. She didn't change her name to gain access. She carried herself through every room I've watched her enter, with more elegance, restraint, and integrity than most of the people sitting at this table." A hush fell over the room. He continued, "She's built something with her own hands. She's created a brand that speaks to emotion and meaning. And she's done all of it without asking for approval. That's not dangerous, Aunt Margaret. That's admirable." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. Richard turned to Olivia then, gently, like she was the only one in the room. "I married her because she challenges me, because she reminds me of everything I never knew I was missing, and because every day I'm proud to stand beside her." Olivia's heart clenched, not because he had defended her, but because he had done it publicly, unflinchingly, in a room where silence was currency and pride was rarely spoken aloud. Margaret said nothing, but the rest of the table shifted. One cousin offered a hesitant smile, another asked about her next collection. Slowly the tide turned, not out of affection perhaps, but out of respect. Later that evening, After the guests had gone and coats were retrieved, Margaret approached Olivia by the fireplace. "You're stronger than you look," she said quietly. "I've had to be." Margaret nodded once. "Make sure he remembers that." And with that, she walked away. In the car on the way home, Olivia sat in silence for a while, then turned to Richard. "Why did you say all that?" He glanced at her, then back to the road. "Because I should have said it a long time ago." She reached for his hand, laced her fingers with his, and in that small gesture beneath the night sky they sealed a new kind of promise, not in ink, not in ceremony, but in action. They had stood in the fire and walked out, side by side. But the world wasn't done testing them. Beyond the lights of the city, an envelope sat on Olivia's old desk at the vineyard, unopened, from a name she thought she'd never see again, and it would bring with it a truth that could change everything. The first boutique to call was in Manhattan. Then came the one in Paris. Then a quiet, handwritten letter from a gallery owner in London who had seen her work online and wanted to commission an exclusive series inspired by grief and rebirth. Each message arrived like a whisper, not from corporate agents but from artists, curators, and collectors who spoke the same language Olivia did, soul. She never launched a formal campaign. There was no glossy branding. Just her pieces, photographed in natural light, shared quietly by the women who wore them. Evelyn Hart posted one on her social media, a close-up of a rose-gold bracelet wrapped around her wrist, with the caption, "Sometimes strength is silent." Within hours, messages flooded in. Olivia could no longer keep up alone. At first, she resisted expanding. She didn't want her art to become mechanical. She feared that growth would dilute the honesty of what she created. But Richard, who had once tried to manage her, didn't offer advice. He didn't push, he only said, "What do you need to protect what you've built?" That question changed everything. Because now, she had a choice. She hired 3 artisans, women she trained personally in the conservatory. She refused to outsource. Every piece would still be touched by human hands. Every design would remain rooted in emotion. She named her brand Light of Soul, after the sketchbook that had once saved her from silence. And the world responded. The collection premiered in Paris in a private showing attended by artists, writers, musicians, not just fashion insiders. Pieces sold out within days. Critics described her style as introspective luxury, design that wasn't just seen, but felt. She was invited to speak on panels about creative integrity. Vogue called her the quiet storm reshaping wearable art. A museum in San Francisco asked to exhibit her early works in a show called Emergence from Silence to Spark. But for Olivia, the true success wasn't on paper. It was in the handwritten letters from women around the world, survivors, widows, young artists. One girl from Brazil wrote, "Your necklace made me feel like I wasn't alone, like someone had captured what I couldn't say." That was the currency Olivia cared about. And Richard, he watched all of it unfold with a pride so deep it startled him. He didn't hover, he didn't claim credit. He brought coffee during her meetings, held her hand before every speaking engagement, sat in the back row with quiet eyes and a half smile whenever she was under the spotlight. One night after a boutique opening in London, they walked through Hyde Park under a drizzle of fog and lamplight. Olivia had removed her heels, walking barefoot through the damp grass, holding her shoes in one hand. "Do you ever miss the vineyard?" he asked softly. She looked at him for a moment, thoughtful. "No, I carry it with me." He nodded. "You know, people think I built an empire." "You did," she said gently. "But it never felt like mine. Not until now. Not until I watched you build something with nothing but your truth." She reached for his hand. "Then maybe we're both building something new," she whispered. By the end of that year, Light of Soul had opened flagship stores in Manhattan, Paris, and Tokyo. Each store was designed like a sanctuary. Soft lights, warm wood, mirrors framed in brass, and a quiet reading room where visitors could write letters to themselves before purchasing a piece. Her designs were still raw, still intimate, but now they carried the voice of a woman who had been broken and rebuilt, not by love alone, but by creation, by choice, by the courage of stepping into her own name. At a gala celebrating artists under 40, Olivia was honored with a Lifetime Impact Award. She wore a deep crimson dress and a piece from her first ever collection, a simple silver pendant titled "Begin Again." When she stepped on stage, the room stood, not out of politeness, out of reverence. She looked out into the crowd and found Richard near the back. He wasn't in a tuxedo. He wasn't there as a CEO. He stood beside her artisans, clapping like a man who knew exactly what it meant to see someone rise from ashes. She stepped up to the microphone, cleared her throat, and said, "I used to think value came from being seen. Then I realized it comes from seeing yourself. Every piece I create is a fragment of a life I wasn't sure I'd survive. But here I am. And here we are." Light of Soul was never just about jewelry. It's about memory, emotion, and the truth that even the quietest voices have something powerful to say. Thunderous applause followed. That night, back at their penthouse overlooking the city, Olivia stood on the balcony, barefoot again, hair undone by the wind. Richard joined her, wrapping an arm around her waist. "You looked unstoppable tonight," he said. She leaned into him. "I didn't need to be unstoppable, just honest." He turned to her then, holding her face in both hands. "I hope you know," he said softly, "that being loved by you, watching you become who you were always meant to be, has been the most humbling honor of my life." She smiled, her eyes shimmering. "And being seen by you," she replied, "without needing to shrink, has been mine." They kissed beneath the city lights. And somewhere inside, they both knew. The contract that once bound them had been torn. What remained was not obligation. It was devotion. But life had one final chapter to write, a chapter not of success but of legacy, and it would begin in the hills of Tuscany, where promises once whispered under stars would finally take root in soil. The villa in Tuscany wasn't grand. It wasn't marble or glass or opulence. It was olive trees and sunlight, terracotta rooftops, a garden that grew wild on purpose, a place where silence felt like a blanket, not a punishment. They bought the property 5 years after the first gallery opening. After Light of Soul had become a household name in cities Olivia had never even visited. After Richard had restructured his entire business to allow space, not just for them, but for breath, for life. Here the world didn't knock on their door. No cameras, no formal dinners, just them and the twins, a boy and a girl, Luca and Clara, born on a quiet spring morning in Florence. The nurse had said, "You're already a family of balance." One with Richard's quiet stillness, one with Olivia's bright, curious fire. Now, at 6 years old, they ran barefoot through the garden, laughter echoing off the stone walls. Clara wore one of Olivia's earliest necklaces, tied with a ribbon around her wrist like a charm. Luca had taken to building miniature sculptures out of olive branches and rocks, insisting they were installations. Olivia watched them from the veranda, a warm cup of tea in her hands, her hair swept loosely over one shoulder, touched by streaks of sunlight and time. Richard stepped out beside her, barefoot, wearing linen and peace. He slipped an arm around her waist. "They're too quiet," he murmured. "Which means they're up to something," she smiled. He kissed her temple, then looked out across the vineyard. Not unlike the one she had grown up on. It was smaller here, slower. The vines curled lazily along wooden trellises, kissed by Tuscan air. It was the place they had chosen to begin again. And tonight they were celebrating 15 years. Not since the wedding. But since the night, everything changed. Since the night, he broke his own rules. There was no formal party, no grand gesture, just a dinner beneath the fig tree, candles in old wine bottles, music drifting from an old record player, the children asleep, the scent of lavender on the breeze. Olivia wore a soft white dress, no shoes. Around her neck hung "Begin Again," the same pendant she had worn at her first award ceremony, now slightly worn, but more meaningful than ever. Richard poured the last of the wine into their glasses and sat across from her. They didn't speak at first, they didn't need to. He watched her in the candlelight, the way her eyes shimmered as she looked out into the darkened hills. She was older now. So was he. But there was a richness in her presence, the kind that didn't fade with time, only deepened. Finally, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, a piece of paper. She raised an eyebrow. Another contract. He smiled, handed it to her. It wasn't legal parchment, just a torn page from one of her sketchbooks. On it, in his handwriting, I, Richard Blackwood, agree to spend the rest of my life doing the following: loving you loudly when you need it, quietly when you don't, supporting your fire, protecting your silence, and remembering always that you were never mine to control, only mine to cherish. Her eyes filled. She looked at him, speechless, then folded the paper and pressed it to her chest. I accept, she whispered. He reached across the table and took her hand. No lawyers this time. No clauses, she said. No end date, he added. They stood together, walking toward the edge of the terrace where the hills kissed the horizon. The sun had almost disappeared, just a sliver of fire left across the sky. Richard pulled her gently into his arms, and for a long moment they stood in silence. Then he said, barely audible, "You're my true contract, Olivia. Not written in ink, but in time, in moments, in everything that came after the rules broke." She leaned into him, her head against his chest. "And that contract," he finished, "will last forever." They kissed under the Tuscan sky, not like lovers desperate to begin, but like soulmates who had already walked the storm and found shelter in one another. Behind them, the wind rustled through the vines. Ahead of them, eternity stretched wide and golden. And in the middle was love. Quiet, deep, unshakable. Not every love begins with an "I love you." Some begin with silence, distance, a contract signed out of fear, not desire. But when two souls are destined to meet, no rules, no pride, no time can stand in their way. Olivia and Richard proved that true love doesn't come from perfection, but from the courage to emotionally strip bare, to love with flaws, to start over even when everything seems broken. And have you ever loved someone beyond the rules? Have you ever felt trapped in an emotional contract you didn't choose? If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and tell us in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Your like helps this channel grow and continue bringing you more emotional stories like this. Share with someone special.